But for me, what really led to a shift was continuing the trauma work, like my own story work. And so going to different programs and some counseling intensives where basically your story is just laid out and torn apart in all the good ways to figure out, like, where are these major pain points that you're still carrying into the present. And so from there, the two things that shifted for me were when I understood that the direct correlation between trauma and addiction for me, and also how, for me, the opposite of addiction was not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection.
Welcome back to the Sobriety Diaries, friends. I'm your host, Nate Kelly, founder of Pod Studio and recovering alcoholic, 8.5 years from my last drink. Check today's show notes for more information on the services we offer at Pod Studio and how I can help you bring your message to life if you're an aspiring podcaster, entrepreneur, content creator. I would love to help. You can also catch all of our video episodes at youtube.com/Nate Kelly. Now let's open the diary on Michael Ayala-White. Michael is a trauma survivor, a recovery coach, an entrepreneur. We have so much in common. Michael, welcome to the show. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate being on.
Very excited to dive in to our conversation and learn more about your path to recovery, but also how you're now giving back. And I think that is key in keeping our own strengths in recovery. So I always like to start with your personal path and sort of learn a bit more about you. And then of course we'll talk about all the great stuff you're doing today, but I'll let you kick it off and sort of start where it makes sense to jump into your journey.
For me, it was really in 2019 when there was a really like hopefully a quarter life crisis, not necessarily a midlife crisis, hopefully a little bit longer than that, where I had the reality of being confronted with lots of trauma had finally caught up to me. And for probably 4 or 5 years, I knew that something was off. I knew that something was going on inside. I didn't have the language or the framework to be able to understand the reality of how just because something happened in the past doesn't mean it doesn't affect your present. And similar to people who, as you are, you're wearing glasses. It's like if you scratch those glasses, that's an event that happens in the past, yes, but if you keep those same lenses in there, that's going to affect the way you see the present and the future, unless you get a new pair of lenses. And so for me, lots and lots of early childhood, adolescent, and preteen abuse that I really didn't deal with, didn't know how to process. And so from that point on, the seeds for me of addiction were laid, where I didn't know how to process big emotions. I didn't know how to handle situations as I got older, as the stakes got higher, as the relationships got more important, as pressure grew. And so in 2019, everything really came to a head for me where I just had a mental breakdown. And at that point, lost my job and then really started to spiral out of control. And
now, was that because of other work stuff or your behaviors related to addiction?
Yep. So addiction and behavior for sure. And then from there, once my job, I worked in a lot of nonprofit and some nonprofit/faith work. And so once those guardrails of the job came off, at that point, I was like, okay, my life is falling apart and I do not know how to process this information and these experiences. And so what I did was I started to numb out, and my addiction really started to pick up speed. And so the seeds of it started to really bloom before 2019, but really picked up speed in 2019, where my really cross-addicted, my alcohol use started to increase dramatically, where it went from socially or just, one every couple of days to every single night. I'm using alcohol to go to sleep, using alcohol to numb my feelings, using alcohol to escape. And then from there as well, I started to use sex as a way of escape, as a way of getting dopamine hits, as a way of connecting, I should say, of really allowing something that is a beautiful form of connection to just be a way of escape, and really objectifying women to allow myself to feel better. And so these things start to fuse, and I started to dive deeper and deeper and deeper into addiction. And for me, again, the seeds had been there for a long time, and the reality of, for me personally, how pornography use affected my brain, not understanding how that was interacting with my own connections with people, really started to bloom there. And it was all a form of escape.
Yeah, I think that's so relatable. The sort of need to escape or just kind of numb or disassociate, like escaping what our situation is, or wherever we are, just needing that escape.
Yeah. And so the commonality in the data as well with addiction is the experience is numbness, dissociation, pick your thing. But what's underneath most people who have things that become full-blown addiction is either some sort of combination of either trauma or traumatic event, or the lack of care, which is itself, trauma might be too strong, but neglect, abandonment, things like that. And so addiction is your best attempt at getting your needs met from something that you didn't have, or something awful that you experienced back here that you don't know how to process. And so what recovery really is recovery is learning all the things we didn't learn as kids. The ability to process big emotions, the ability to stay in conflict, the ability to actually sit with ourselves. That's recovery. You learn these tools to stay sober, yes, but sobriety and recovery are two different things. You can be sober all day long. And as someone who is a recovering alcoholic, I'm sure you're familiar with the term dry drunk, where it's like, listen, man, you're more miserable now than when you were drinking, because the work that actually needs to happen internally isn't going on. Yeah, it's great that you're not drinking. That's really good, but you're a curmudgeon. Like, you are miserable. Yes. So the commonality of some sort of either trauma or abandonment, neglect, or need is there. And what addiction is it's a solution to the pain of your original problem. But what happens is the thing that makes you feel good in the moment then spirals out of control. And now you've got two problems and no solutions, and your life's getting worse. And for me, the reality of understanding, okay, I have these addictions, and the deeper I start to dig, the more I'm like, oh, these are all just attempts to try to numb myself out from the original problem, which for me was abuse, abandonment, neglect. And so that I was then confronted with what I realized was the even harder work, which was, well, now that I was sober and the brain fog was clearing for a little while, now I see the real work, which is dealing with the trauma, reparenting, things like that. And I was scared where it's like, okay, like I have to actually go down this road and do the work and see if I can actually pull out some of these destructive tendencies and roots in order to kind of take out the landmines, so that addiction, that the desire for addiction would come down, if that makes sense.
That brain fog starts to lift. And I relate to what you're saying so much, because prior to, I thought sobriety was just not drinking. I had no clue that this world existed. And when that fog does start to lift and you start being honest with yourself and perhaps correcting behaviors that you don't like about yourself, it really it's a stepping stone, right? It starts this path, this journey to a better version of ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And recovery causes you to be honest with yourself about yourself. Like, it causes you to have to take an honest look at not just the behavior, but about the core beliefs about yourself. And typically with addiction, there's shame, there's guilt, and guilt's not necessarily a bad thing because it helps you to learn, okay, I don't necessarily want to do that. But toxic shame is lethal in the ability to see ourselves in a healthy way. Because if we believe that we are fundamentally bad, well, then our behavior is going to follow that belief. But if we understand that, like, hey, can I have compassion typically to the events that have happened when we were younger, where it's like I was powerless and I had no control over the trauma or the neglect or the abandonment that I experienced. Well, if we can have compassion on that, maybe we can bring some healing into our story that takes off some of the landmines that keep setting us off into our addiction to numb out.
That's a great point. There is a significant difference between guilt and shame. And is that something that you see and discuss with clients? I think, to your point, guilt can be good. If you did something that's not trustworthy or that lacks integrity, you should have guilt about that. But then shame is sort of, I don't know. How do you see shame versus guilt?
Yeah, it's a good question. Guilt is, I have done something wrong. And again, I think guilt is very necessary, because if you don't have guilt, that means that there are like legitimate sociopathic tendencies where it's like, okay, what's going on in your conscience that has it seared? And that's a very different question and approach. So guilt is, I have done something wrong. Shame is, there's something fundamentally wrong with me. Those are the two different things that need to be clarified, because guilt is good. Toxic shame, I would say, is never good, because toxic shame creates, first and foremost, emotional isolation. It creates an isolation from yourself. Something's wrong with me and I want to run away from myself, but I can't. And so then the propensity is to try to numb out, figure out, okay, how do I not feel this way? And then that also leads to physical isolation. You start to remove yourself from relationships. And so for me, that's one of the core things that I talk about with clients, is the difference between guilt and shame, where I'm like, hey, it's okay to feel guilty if you've actually done something wrong. It makes you a human being. That's actually very necessary. And there can be some real lessons to learn from those failures. Shame is poison. And so you need to be careful. And whenever I'm with clients and I sense their shame, I'll call it out. And I'm like, hey, man, I see your shame right now. And I just want to name it, because I can tell that you're pulling back. Whether it's your body language, your head is starting to drop, which is a very natural physical response when we feel shame, is our head actually drops. We start to kind of come inward to protect ourselves. I'm like, I can see it all, and I just want to let you know that you're not a bad person. And typically, that creates some sort of emotional response where they're wrestling with their shame. And I'm like, hey, I'm here with you. I see it. We're going to name it, and we're going to bring it to the light, and then we're going to keep going. It's a very important distinction, the difference between guilt and toxic shame. Toxic shame, in my opinion, is never healthy. But guilt can be very healthy.
So, Michael, then what kickstarted your path to recovery? Did you seek treatment? Did you utilize 12 steps? So what sort of set you on that path?
Yeah, so I got 2019, really after a 6-month period where I was just kind of spinning, not really sure how to find proper footing. I got connected with an organization that dealt with men who had past trauma and addiction issues. And that was really what opened my eyes to this reality of like, oh, these two for me are very correlated, very related, where my addictions are my best attempt to bury what's going on underneath. And so from there, got into 12-step, and I went to different 12-step groups, worked the steps, very helpful. to start that process. But for me, what really led to a shift was continuing the trauma work, like my own story work. And so going to different programs and some counseling intensives where basically your story is just laid out and torn apart in all the good ways to figure out like where are these major pain points that you're still carrying into the present. And so from there, the two things that shifted for me were when I understood that the direct correlation between trauma and addiction for me, and also how for me the opposite of addiction was not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And the reality that for me, I now have a band of brothers that I've met in one particular counseling group that I can tell anything to. And there's no judgment, there's no shame, there's only love and the ability to go, okay, what is it that you need in this moment? And so met these guys in March of 2022 in Colorado, and we were from all over the country, and we went to the same kind of inpatient place to work through our traumas and our addictions. And we got out 2 weeks later and met on a Wednesday night via Zoom call, and we've been meeting every Wednesday night for 2.5 years. And having that community has been essential. I would not have made it had it not been for this type of community. The reality where it's like you can just bare your soul every Wednesday, the good, the bad, and the absolutely ugly. And there's guys who understand and who have language and have experience in addiction and recovery to sit with you regardless of where you find yourself and help you move forward. It's been pivotal.
It really is pivotal. I think, I love hearing, the opposite of addiction is connection. I couldn't agree more. I think, and we all find our own path, right? There's no linear point A and point B from addiction to recovery, and we each walk our own path. But, the common thread that I see in having, hundreds, maybe thousands by now of conversations is that connection and finding your people and finding your community. So I love that you said that. I'm curious now, so how far into your sobriety or your recovery journey then did you decide, hey, I can help other people do this? Or, I want to give back what was given to me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for people that are familiar with 12-step, right, like step 12 is like, okay, here's what you've been given. Now you can go ahead and give that back. So for me, it was probably, we're in 2024 now, so probably a year and a half ago where I went back to school, and 6 months out of coming out of that program in Colorado, I'd been having conversations with a lot of guys, just like loosely, and seeing like, hey, there's a real need here. Like there's a need for men to be able to talk about their feelings first and foremost. There's a need for men to have language to talk about their feelings, because men don't want to say that they're lonely, but a lot of guys are lonely. Men don't want to say that they've been hurt, but a lot of guys are hurt. All we typically know is like angry, horny, furious, whatever. But there's a lot more emotions of like, tell me about your sadness. Tell me about the fact that your dream was crushed and you turned to addiction. Like, these are the conversations that I want to know. But for most men, we haven't seen the model of what that looks like. And so, like, for me, it was like, okay, how do I learn the language, which I did for myself, and then go back to school and really receive the backside of the training that I received personally. And so the reality of like being on this journey for 3.5 years brought me to, okay, well, let me go and get certified in trauma-informed coaching certification. And let me see if I can do this as a business, because I want to be able to do this full time. And so it was about a year and a half ago where I went back to school, finished trauma-informed certification, also got some inner child work certification as well to walk with guys through their story and help them to build a framework where I'm like, bro, this little, like, for if your name's Tim, like, listen, man, little Tim's carrying around these wounds that big Tim doesn't know how to handle. And so like we gotta figure this out, because your life is a tire fire. It's not a judgment, it's just a fact. And you were the one who said that. So how do we go back and engage and really build a bridge back to where little Tim finds himself hurt, and see how does healing enter that part of your story, and how does your life change from there? So it's about a year and a half ago where I went back to school and got some additional certifications, and really just picked up what I had been doing the past 2 years, just from a business standpoint.
Enter Wayward Coaching, right? It's such a good name. I think it speaks to building that bridge. You know, there's sort of this lost version of ourselves that we need to reclaim and you know, bring into the current. I'm looking at your website. I really love, and I'll link everything in today's show notes, but it's wayward-coaching.com. You have an addiction and recovery path, an inner child path, trauma-informed coaching path, like these different variations of ways that we find ourselves deep in addiction. Do you vary the sort of approach with your clients depending on, you know, sort of how they come to you or what they need to bridge?
Yeah, so it's all based on the initial consultation call. So I offer free 20-minute consultation calls around like, hey, what brings you on this phone call right now? Because everybody finds themselves in a unique spot to their experience. Now, there's enough trend and data and studies done to go, okay, if you are dealing with neglect and abandonment, or if your attachment style is this, here's the propensity to what your behavior is probably going to be. So that's fine. But the experience for the individual is unique to them. And so I want to know about that. I want to hear about that through their eyes, through their heart, through their mind, through their body. What's going on in your body? Do some somatic work or some body work as well to help people learn how to regulate their emotions and sit in the pain, sit in the discomfort. It's a huge thing, especially for men, because we typically live from the neck up. We live in our intellect, and we don't engage our bodies. And the answers we're looking for are found in the very places we don't know how to navigate, which is typically our body. So the paths are unique to each one's unique, but there is overlap for sure of the reality of if you're in the addiction path, you're going to do some inner child work. If you're in the inner child path, there's probably some addictive tendency that may not be full-blown addiction, but it's something we want to take a look at and go, okay, here, the seeds are there. And if you keep going down this path, you will end up, there's a good chance you're going to end up here. And then trauma-informed coaching is just for guys who are like, hey, I just want to become a better version of myself, and I don't even know where to start. Okay, great. Here's a path for you. Like, let's explore. Let's be curious about who you are. And for the other two, inner child and addiction and recovery path, toxic shame drowns out curiosity about yourself, specifically in the addiction path. Because if you have an addiction, I probably don't have to convince you by the time you get to me that it's bad or that it's destructive. That's why you're reaching out in the first place.
You went to the website for a reason. So let's be honest. Exactly. Let's dig in.
That's right. So I don't need to, nor do I want to, heap any more shame on you. What I want to do is I want to create curiosity about how did you get here? And then from there, from the curiosity, can we birth awareness? Can we birth awareness about what's going on inside of you when you feel like, I need to do this thing or I will die? Now, you won't. Alcohol withdrawal is one of the few where it's like, okay, that needs to be handled with some kid gloves, because depending on the severity of the level of alcoholism, the detoxing of that can be very serious. But generally speaking, if you don't drink, or if you don't have sex, or if you don't gamble, if you don't shop, you're not going to die. But your brain is telling you, if we don't do this, I'm going to die. So I want to know, how did we get there? I understand the neurobiology of what's going on in the brain, but emotionally, What is in your story that is causing you to go back to this over and over and over again? That's what I'm curious about. That's what I want them to be curious about. Because if we can be curious about that, we can find some core negative beliefs that are big red buttons that get pressed of whenever I feel like I'm not enough, I am useless, I am invisible, I am whatever. I should have been blank. When those narratives get pushed, well, now, as a child, we didn't want to feel those. And so then we became an adult and found things that helped us to not feel those.
Right.
And thus the addiction cycle is going.
It's interesting you mentioned sort of the physicality of it, because that trauma can present itself as pain or, different physical things within our body. And sometimes people don't realize, I've had this, rotator cuff issue or this back pain for decades or whatever it may be. Do you incorporate any physical activity or, body movement into your programs?
Yeah. So I do some light body and somatic work. That's something that I'm pursuing additional certification on as well, because it's so important to understand that it's all connected. I love the example you used of back pain, where people are like, yeah, I've had lower back pain for forever. I'm like, okay, well, my first thing is like, well, do you stretch? Because a lot of lower back pain is actually like hamstrings and glutes pulling down. And
Yeah.
it's chained and connected. So like that's a very simple thing. But if it's beyond that, it's like, okay, well, tell me about when you're stressed. Tell me about how your shoulders are always tight and you feel like you're carrying the weight of the world or whatever. Because when we're always in fight, flight, or freeze, specifically fight or flight mode, like we're releasing cortisol all the time into our bodies. And that just creates havoc long-term, both on our organs, on weight gain, on our ability to not be able to sleep, not be able to focus. Like it's all connected, right? Like there's a great book called The Body Keeps a Score. It's a very, Bessel van der Kolk is like,
that is an amazing book.
Yeah. So he's like one of the OGs, right?
Yeah.
Of like, he's been around for a long time and he really paved the way to go, hey, listen, like your memory might not remember, but your body does. And so when you're in a room and all of a sudden you feel threatened, something in that room is causing your nervous system to kick on and go, there's a threat here. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But something happened that is causing you to feel that way. And so specifically for men, like I want to teach them that their body is not an adversary. Their body is an ally. But the problem with addiction, rooted in toxic shame, is that we start to believe that our body's an adversary. Not just in the way we look, although that can be a whole nother layer of shame and insecurity, but in the way that we operate, in the way that our body emotes feelings and urges, which are signals letting us know what's going on inside. But typically as men, we just push those down and ignore them. Nope. And it's like, bro, you have now positioned yourself into the fast lane for acting out, whatever that looks like for you. Because you
like a time bomb.
Like a time bomb. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we're ready to explode. It's crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yep, you have now pressed the on button. And at some point, unless you engage that and disarm it, that bomb will go off. And you will return to whatever your thing or things are. It's inevitable unless you engage it. So teaching men, number one, like just light breathing work to help them kind of come down out of anxiety or up out of depression, either way, depending on which way they're going. And then number two, to sit in their body and start to be curious about, like, where does your sadness live? I know where mine lives. I know when I feel certain things in certain parts of my body, typically it's associated with emotions or urges. And all of that data helps you regain control of your body. Because right now, your body is an adversary. And neurobiologically, you've also programmed yourself to respond a specific way in addiction. But if we can start to put the puzzle pieces together as to how you got here, how your body works, Well, now you can start to take control of the driver's seat of your life and not just the addictive part or the immature part or the angry part or whatever it is that are all vying for this seat on the bus, and your higher self is thrown in the back in those moments. So all of these things are incorporated in all three paths, really, specifically the first two paths, because typically it's like, hey, we need to get you back in the driver's seat.
Yeah. Wow. Really great information from a trauma informed standpoint. You're so well spoken. So I love providing resources. So today we've discussed Wayward Coaching and The Body Keeps Score. Any other thing that's top of mind? Any resources you like to suggest to folks in early recovery?
Early recovery, yeah. So obviously, like 12-step is a great space because for me, transformation is a pretty simple formula. It's not an easy road, but the formula itself is pretty simple. And transformation is the right information plus the right community plus time. I think that's really it. And the road is very hard.
Yeah.
That's not easy, but the formula is simple. And so 12 steps is a great place to get some good information. And just as importantly, like if you can find your people, like the concept of it's called dislocation, similar to like if your shoulder or your knee pop out of socket, until it's put back into place, like it's going to be off, you're going to feel it. Being a person without a people is a form of emotional dislocation that can jab at you that I don't belong. And that can fuel addiction in a very subconscious way, as some of the studies have shown, where like when you feel like you're alone and you don't have a place to belong to, and you don't have a people that think that you matter, man, that can definitely fuel addiction. And so 12-step groups can be great for that. I would also recommend a book. It's a little bit of a longer book, but it's a really good read, especially for people that have toxic shame about their own addictions. And it's called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, by a guy named Gabor Mate. And he is a medical doctor, also one of the guys who's been doing this for a long time, does not get enough credit. He's out in Vancouver and works in some of the worst parts of Vancouver with people that have addiction and mental illness. And the book is such a beautiful book in two ways. Number one, it really humanizes people who have addiction. And so addiction has become this kind of buzzword and thing, but there's still a stigma around it for people that don't understand it. And what it does is it really helps you to see that these are just people. And it also helps you to see like the people that he mentions who are willing to share their stories. And you read their stories and you're like, of course this is where you ended up. Like when you see it, like it makes sense, but it's so easy to just dehumanize. Oh, they're just a blank, whatever. And it's like, look at their story.
Right.
How in the heck would you respond if you went through that as a 5-year-old child, as an 8-year-old child? How is their brain, which your prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop until you're in your mid-20s to late 20s, depending on if you're male or female. That's where all decision-making, rationale, intellect live. Your limbic system is like 95 to 97% formed when you pop out. So all you have is emotion. So as a 6-year-old kid who's being molested, how are you supposed to respond?
Right. What do we expect?
What do you expect? So like, it really brings in this human and this graceful empathy element that's so beautiful. And the second thing it does is that as smart and as brilliant as Gabor Mate is, he owns his own unique addiction of buying classical records impulsively to the point where it puts him and his family in like financial crisis. And so he understands and he sees himself as, quote, one of them. And it's such a beautiful thing because it's a vulnerable posture to go, hey, I'm just a guy whose addiction is different, so I can manage it. But with what happened to me and the way that my impulse is, if I'm not careful, like I will be in the same consequential situations as them. And so it's really beautiful to me, where I'm like, this guy's handling this in the way that I think it needs to be handled. And it's a great book full of a lot of good information.
That's awesome. We'll do a little research and link that today too. Have you read The Autumn Balloon? It's
No.
by Kenny Papora. It's The Autumn Balloon. It sounds very similar to what you're explaining. He weaves in his own childhood experiences and how it now has affected his decision making as an adult. It's very raw, but it's like a mix of a memoir and it's really beautifully written. It reminds me very much of the book you're talking about. You should check it out.
Yeah.
The Autumn Balloon.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I mean, for me, like one of the benefits of now being in recovery has been, there's this part of me that I would call Mr. Performer, because my gifts were just external, and I know I can speak, and like
Yeah.
I've spoken in front of a lot of people at different times, and now it's more of just like I can choose to lead with my weakness, and it's such a freeing experience to go like, I don't have to perform for you. Like if I'm not doing well, I'm not doing well. Okay.
Well, yeah, let's start there. Right. If I'm not doing
Yeah.
well, perfect place to start.
You know, and then the other thing too is like just remembering that, like, if I'm not doing well, like it's just a Wednesday. Like today's just Wednesday.
Yes.
And like each day has enough for itself, where it's like there's enough beauty and brokenness in both days, and in both aspects of a day, where it's like, okay, like with a guy, it's a joke where like on Wednesday nights we'll check in, and like some guys are like, they're just going through it. They're like, it's
Yeah.
just Wednesday.
Yeah.
And it's just an acknowledgement of like, it's just a day. Tomorrow could be better, and it's okay.
I love that. I was just gonna, I like to close with some like parting words or some experience, some wisdom for those in early recovery. But I think you just so beautifully wrapped everything up. You have this way of this confidence in your message and how to convey it to an audience. I'm so glad that we crossed paths. Michael Ayala?
Yep,
Okay.
you got it.
Michael Ayala-White, founder of Wayward Coaching. A lot of links in today's show notes. Check out all of the information. Michael, great job. Thank you so much for chatting today.
Thanks so much for having a space like this, Nate. It's so important to have these conversations, and just be raw and try to be honest with where we are and where we want to go, and just as importantly, where we've come from.
Yes.
So having a space to do that is so important. So thanks for doing this.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks so much for listening today, friends. Hopefully you heard something inspiring and that resonates with you. If you're an aspiring podcaster or have your own message to share, head over to podcastnate.com and book a discovery call. I have helped countless aspiring podcasters to launch their show and share their message, and I'd be honored to help you do the same. Remember, everyone has a story. Yours could help save a life. Make sure you subscribe to the Sobriety Diaries so you never miss an upload. We're back with new episodes every Wednesday. Bye, everyone.